Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
Often it seems that all we see in the media are violence, conflict, and competition, whether it's in the news, in entertainment, or even in sports reporting. And this can have a significant impact on how we feel, how we see the world, and how we deal with conflict. In our episode, Portraying Peace in the Media, I have with me Marianne Perez de Fransius, who is the founder of Peace is Sexy. She will share with us how exposure to so much violence in the media is negatively affecting us as individuals and as social beings. How do we break this cycle? You'll learn where to find media that gives you food for creative, collaborative, and compassionate thoughts through Marianne's initiatives with Peace is Sexy and the Peace Superhero series. Now, Marianne Perez de Fransius, and let me spell her last name, Perezde, and then capital Fransius, is a peace builder and educator. As founder of the Peace is Sexy and Peace Superheroes, she steeps in peace media and the issues of how violence and conflict are portrayed in the media. Now, Marianne got her Bachelors of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and her Master's in Peace and Conflict Studies at the European Peace University in Austria. She is currently living in Mozambique, where in addition to working on her own projects, she is also training local journalists in peace journalism. So, Marianne, we've been working to getting you on this program for quite some time, and I've been a huge fan of Peace is Sexy and your new initiative. So I'm so excited about you being part of our program series this month.
Thank you, and it's always so great to be able to connect with people or talk to people, rather, that I've been emailing with and following their work, too. So thank you for having me on.
Yes, you're welcome. You know, it's amazing, the virtual world, the virtual online world. You know, we can really easily connect to people all over the world, and you're literally in Mozambique now as we're talking. So let's get into our program and say a little bit more about your background and experience in peace media and why this topic drives you to do the initiatives you're passionately engaged in right now.
Well, as a kid, I think I must have been about 11 years old, I remember watching the war in Iraq on CNN, and I remember Bernard Shaw standing there reporting and having bombs dropping behind him in Baghdad, and so actually it was that made me want to become a journalist originally, and so I guess I was always interested in how war and conflict were portrayed in the media, and then like after Georgetown actually convinced me that instead of going to journalism school, I should go do a master's degree in a specific topic, so that way then when I became a journalist, I would have specialized knowledge of a topic. And so I decided that I would get a master's in peace and conflict studies. And so I approached my master's from the point of view of media. And so in every class and for every paper, I was basically looking at the role the media had to do with this peace process, with how war was portrayed in the media, with how peace is portrayed in the media or isn't, what the role of the media can be in peace-building initiatives. And I was and still really am obsessed with that. But when I came out of my master's, I actually kind of went the other way, and instead of going towards journalism, I actually went more towards the peace world. And so I moved back to the States, and I was working and living in New York, and I was working a lot with the Peace Alliance and the campaign to establish a U.S. Department of Peace and doing a lot of media work for them. And I saw a lot of how peace is not portrayed in the media and how difficult it was for a peace organization to get any kind of coverage in mainstream media. And what I realized is that we're actually getting a really skewed view of reality and a limited set of behaviors that are modeled through media. And so it's actually kind of difficult to get inspiration and to get motivation to be peace because we don't see it in the media at all, because all we see is conflict and violence, or most of what we see is conflict and violence.
So I guess for me, it begs the question, why? Why is the media so focused on that negativity and not giving more inspiration, as you said, and motivation to, we all desperately want peace. We don't want war, or at least for most people, we don't. So why is the media so focused on that? And so let's just kind of start there.
Right. Well, I think I wrote my master's thesis about this. I have lots to say, so feel free to cut me off if it gets into too much detail. But part of the problem, first, when I talk about the media, I mean both the news media and entertainment. And in news media, in journalism, there's kind of a dictum or a saying. There's kind of a saying that is, if it bleeds, it leads, and you've probably heard that before. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that if it's some kind of violent story where there's been a shooting, or if it's a war, then it's going to end up on the homepage of your newspaper's website, or it's going to be the top story on the TV news, or it's what you're going to hear on the radio news 10 minutes or 5 minutes. And so that's on the journalism side. On the entertainment side, I think production houses have spent a lot of money investing in these kind of like action movies, in car chases and explosions and all these kind of special effects, but also a little bit more subtly in verbal violence or emotional violence. We see that a lot in sitcoms, where what makes it funny is that someone is getting put down or being bullied, and so there's kind of this culture that's come up around supporting violence and conflict in the media, and honestly, I think that the biggest problem is that media companies, production houses, just haven't invested in making peace media as attractive. And one of the examples that comes to mind is Avatar, which I thought was an amazing movie, especially with all the 3D effects. And it had a lot of ideas of living together and sharing resources, and a lot of conflict resolution ideas, at least for the first 2/3 to 3/4 of the movie. And then to me, it just seems like in the last quarter, I don't know if you remember the movie Avatar, or if you saw it.
Yes, I did.
But then at the end, kind of the last quarter of the movie, it turned into this whole like war between the people, I can't even remember, the Na'vi, and I guess it was the Americans or the humans, and literally going to war over the resources of this planet. And I honestly think that it's because they felt like to make their money off of this movie, they had to have lots of explosions and have all these special effects. And whereas, the beautiful special effects of the trees and these Na'vi animals moving around wasn't enough. So I think it's something that's really deeply ingrained in our culture, and we have this kind of culture of violence that comes up in subtle and not so subtle ways.
Oh, so true. I don't know. I don't know if you're aware of this new game. I don't know how new it is, but I'd say within the last year that's come out, and it's called the Cards Against Humanity.
No, I haven't heard of it.
You should look that up because it's interesting how they, there's culture of violence, this culture of that, or things that lead to violence, with discrimination and stereotypes and, racial jokes and things of that nature. This whole new game it's catching, it's actually catching a lot of popularity amongst the young people in the United States. And I just heard about it. And so it's just amazing that, people capture their money, their revenue from, as you just said, if it bleeds, it leads. If the entertainment, that's just what people go and see and do. And it just perpetuates, that culture, that leads to violence and stuff. So let me ask you this, because before we talk about how we break the cycle and the things that you're doing, we know, and I appreciate you making the distinction too of the journalism of being news media and entertainment. So what is, or how does this continuous exposure to protracted conflict and war and violence in the media, how is that negatively impacting us as individuals or even collectively? Because one of the things you said is this exposure is negatively affecting us. So what did you find in your results or your experience about that?
Right. Well, there's lots of different research that's been done on this, kind of from a neurolinguistic perspective to a sociological perspective to an example. Let's do a little experiment right now. So you mentioned that I'm living in Mozambique. Have you ever been to Mozambique?
I have not.
Okay. So where's all your knowledge about Mozambique, or maybe even Africa, coming from? Or most of your knowledge?
I would say probably most of it is from the news media, television.
Okay. And so if I say the word Africa to you, what comes up? What images does that conjure up for you?
For the most part, and I distinguish South Africa from the rest of Africa in the sense that I think of conflict and violence, actually.
Right. Because that's most of what gets into the news in the U.S. and Western Europe and probably other parts of the world too. But most of the time when people talk about Africa, they're talking about war in Congo, the Ebola epidemic going on now in Sierra Leone and Guinea, and Western Africa. Never mind that I'm in Mozambique, which is literally across the continent. It's basically like saying, going from California to Florida.
Okay.
and people are asking me how Ebola is over here, and I'm like, that's like asking someone in Florida why, how the wine is or how the grape harvest is in Sonoma Valley.
Yeah, exactly. or how's the hurricanes affecting Kansas?
Right, exactly. So even just from this example, and you're a pretty well-educated and well-informed person, Patty, but just the fact that I say that I live in Africa, not just to you, but to most people, they assume that I must be in some kind of either war-torn part of the world or some place where I'm going to catch Ebola, or at the very least, where there's rampant corruption and children with all kinds of diseases and on the verge of famine. Mm-hmm. But I live in Maputo, which is the capital of Mozambique. I have a beautiful ocean view that I'm actually looking out the window at right now. Maputo is a city that is incredibly dynamic right now. Mozambique is actually one of the 5 fastest growing economies in Africa, and actually I think also probably in the top 10 in the world. And so there is tons of construction going on here. I think I can see 6 or 7 cranes from the windows of my apartment. And there's a lot of actually we just had elections here. Mm-hmm. And they were peaceful elections, so you probably didn't hear anything about them. And we're preparing our vacation for over the holidays, where we're going to go up the coast because Mozambique has some amazing beaches and some of the best scuba diving and underwater fauna in the world. So So it's like a very different picture from what you had been exposed to about Africa and about Mozambique. And so what happens on a neurolinguistic level is, because every time, or an overwhelming number of times, when journalists or the news media talks about Africa, and it's in the context of war, it's in the context of famine, it's in the context of disease, illnesses, those neurons, neuron pathways actually just get reinforced and reinforced and reinforced in our brains. And so then you can kind of think of it as a riverbed. And, the water, the riverbed just kind of, and so it's not going to deviate from it. And so it can lead to subtle and not so subtle consequences. It can lead to policy consequences where, for example, now with Ebola, people or American politicians are saying that all flights coming from Africa, no matter where in Africa, should need to be screened and triple checked. Never mind that actually almost no flights come directly to the United States from Africa, because most airports in Africa don't even meet U.S. standards for safety and security. And then there can be all kinds of forms of racism. Obviously, African Americans already suffer from a lot of racism in the U.S. Africans coming from Africa to the U.S. Can be either the recipients of racism or some kind of patriarchy. And I've seen Europeans and Americans come here to Mozambique and act in a very patriarchal way towards local population, because they assume it's just people who are completely corrupt and uneducated and are waiting for Europeans to come and save them. So so that's on a neurolinguistic kind of level. If we look at a sociological perspective, maybe let's switch conflicts. But there's a lot of Jews and Israelis who consider themselves liberal or left-leaning. And they actually feel like the last Gaza war, the one that we had in August, was justified. And part of the reason I think that they think it was justified is because they got arguments for it in the news. Were firing from Gaza. They had to retaliate, and the only way that they could do that was to put down stronger measures and kind of do a lockdown on Gaza. But if they'd actually gotten concrete alternatives in the media, and if they'd gotten to know Gazans, if they saw that there was someone that they could actually negotiate with, then my belief is that at least the left-leaning or liberal Israelis would feel like that negotiation and some kind of conflict resolution opportunity is available between Israelis and Palestinians. But now everybody, or many Israelis, are just kind of throwing their hands up and saying that there isn't anything to be done. So I think it does have this kind of impact across society too.
Okay. So there's, and I'm sure there's a lot of other very, very negative impacts, and the two that you highlighted being neurolinguistic, kind of what's our brain doing, neurologically, and I love the analogy that you used of the riverbed, and then of course the sociological impact. Before we talk about, is there media that's trying to break this cycle? Before we do that, any other negative impact worthy of note at this point before we move on?
Yeah, there's also been studies in terms of exposure to media influencing behavior. And so That's always a little bit of can be tricky to talk about. I think that there's, I'm not very good with my statistical words. And so I can't remember if it's causation or correlation. So the impact that violent media can have, like what we were talking about before, can be neurolinguistic, it can be sociological, and then another aspect is behavioral. And there have been some links that have been demonstrated between violent media and antisocial behavior. But the good news is also that peaceful or pro-social media can be linked to pro-social behavior. So that gives us something to work towards.
Okay, very good. Well, that is a big part of what we're here today, is to talk about how we break this cycle. And so how is, we're going to talk more about now Peace is Sexy. And so how does Peace is Sexy fit into this, and say more about what this initiative is?
Right. So the idea behind Peace is Sexy is to tell stories that show that peace is sexy, possible, profitable, and fun. And the reason I started this initiative is because when I told people that I got a master's degree in peace studies, most people really feel like peace is totally out of their world, totally inaccessible to them. And what I wanted to do was to show normal people that peace is actually attainable and achievable, and that there are normal people and tons of organizations that are working on peace, and that these stories can be really interesting and exciting and engaging. And the idea is to shift the perspective from something that is kind of idealistic, pie in the sky, or dull, to something that's engaging, exciting, and possible.
And it's interesting because I've read a number of the pieces that you have highlighted around, Peace is Sexy, and of course you have several segments under your blog and website, and I like the fact that they're the everyday person. They're the everyday person who has amazing stories to tell, which I think is sexy. And so I'm so glad that you do that, because people are doing some, and sometimes it doesn't have to be like, they don't have to be like Mother Teresa, right? We're not just highlighting people who are doing amazing things, but people who are doing the typical everyday things to really promote peace. And so it's really a real broad spectrum of people that you cover.
Right, exactly. And I have a broad definition of peace. So my definition of peace is that peace is a dynamic process of creating sustainable relationships with ourselves, with the people around us, with our communities, across countries and nations, and even with the earth itself. And so it's really going from the inner peace to the interpersonal, international, to the interspecies level, and looking at how all these things connect. And sometimes, I do stories and interviews that go through all of these levels, but oftentimes it just focuses on one section and what contribution someone is making to peace at whatever level.
Okay. And how long have you been doing the Peace is Sexy? When did you start that initiative?
I think I started it on Valentine's Day, and I can't remember now if it was Valentine's Day 2012 or 2011. But I've been doing it for a few years.
Yeah, I knew it had been at least 2 or 3 years that you've been doing that. And all right, so really, really interesting stuff. And I'm just going to give some information right now, and we're going to come back to another question, and that is peaceissexy.net. I mean, so there's some really, really great stories, connections, and resource at Peace is Sexy. But there is another initiative and that you started, and because I've been following you for a while, it was really exciting when you first launched it, so I'm really curious to see where you're at. But it's very creative, it's very collaborative, and it started out as a cartoon series called The Peace Superheroes. So say a little bit about what the purpose and intent behind this is in this series.
So the idea behind The Peace Superheroes was actually to take the stories from Peace is Sexy that I've been collecting and fictionalize them and turn them, well, originally it was a cartoon series, and I thought it'd be a comic book series, but it turns out that there's actually more interest and more funding available for a digital game. So I'd originally started with a cartoon because I thought that that would be easier to manage. But parents were saying, "Oh yeah, cartoons are great, but you know, my kid is just on their phone playing all these games all the time or on their computer. So, you know, I think it'd be more interesting if it got turned into a game." And then sure enough, once I started looking into funding opportunities, that's where funding is going, is towards apps. And so we've restructured it a little bit, but we created about 7 or 8 characters that are all based on the stories of people that I've interviewed for Piece of Sexy. And these Peace superheroes have superpowers, but these superpowers are things like empathy and active listening, creativity, thinking outside the box. And then they also have all these great gadgets. So like there's a judgment zapper, and there's a truth reflecting mirror. And there's, you know, kind of like a split screen thing where it's what's going on in the character's mind and what's actually going on in the world. So all these, the idea is that by creating a game and creating an atmosphere where players can confront real life situations. So whether it's bullying, whether it's maybe domestic violence, or whether it's seeing violence in the news, that they can confront these situations in a safe environment in the game, and then practice these different skills. They can call on the superheroes if they need some input or some help in transforming the situation. But the point is to give players an opportunity to transform conflicts peacefully, and to lower the risk so that way when they encounter these conflicts in the real world, that they'll have had some practice, and hopefully we'll be able to translate their behaviors in the game into real life.
And what's the target age that you're focused on?
So right now we're looking at developing it for teens, so about 12 to 18 years old.
Okay. And what is where do you stand in its development, when you think it might launch?
So that's a good question. So right now we're actually in the really early stages. So we had about a year of working on it as a comic book, then that didn't really take off. And so now we're reiterating it as a game, as a digital game. And I've kind of attracted a team of people. So I've got 2 people in Barcelona. I'm in Mozambique, and then I've got another person in Australia, but she's moving to California in the coming weeks. And so and we're all people that are more in the space of peace building and working with youth. And so we're actually looking for people to bring onto the team who have experience in game development, but also who have experience in behavioral research, because we really want to make this a robust and kind of research-backed game, so that it's not only entertaining, and the focus of it is to be entertaining, and our hope is that players think it's so fun that they don't even realize that they're learning something. But we want to make sure that we have the pedagogical elements in it, so that we can create some real behavior change.
Well, it sounds like a great undertaking, and I can't wait to hear more as it develops through your Piece of Sexy website. Now, all right, so we talked about Piece of Sexy and your mission and your goal, and of course, clearly defining peace in a very dynamic way and creating sustainable relationships, and whether it's from the kind of microcosm of the individual all the way up to, as you call, the interspecies. So it's a very broad definition, which I love. And so, but are you the only pro-social media out there? I mean, obviously you're doing your part to lessen the negative impact and break the cycle, but how do we get others on board to do that? And are there others?
So there are definitely others. you might have heard of my piece TV or mypiece.tv, sorry, which is kind of a collection of videos that are peace related or conflict resolution related, and it's just kind of curated videos. They go out and find whatever's on YouTube and share it with people. But then there's websites like Good Is. So a lot of these are kind of on the fringes. I'd say that probably the most mainstream news website actually is the Huffington Post, and specifically they have an impact section, and they have a good news section, which I think does a lot of stuff similar to what Peace is Sexy is doing. And then there's some individual journalists, probably Nick Kristof at the New York Times, who also wrote Half the Sky, does some peace journalism. Certainly the founder of peace journalism, Jake Lynch, he used to be a journalist with the BBC and Sky News. So there is stuff out there. And I think the more that gets created and the more that it gets visible, then the more it's going to start coming into the mainstream media. I mean, I think certainly someone like Oprah is a big advocate for this kind of outlook. She didn't do news, but she probably did more inner peace focused stuff and socially minded stuff. And clearly she was huge and is still very successful. And so clearly there's a desire for it. And I think part of it is also, as media consumers, we have to tell the media producers that this is what we want. And certainly Arianna Huffington, the head of the Huffington Post, in recent public appearances, she said that her prediction is that media is going to start going more and more towards this peace media or pro-social media, and that people are looking for solutions and don't just want to hear about the conflict and the violence all the time.
Now, I imagine that you lived in the U.S. for a bit when you were getting your master's degree, but
actually, when I was getting my undergrad, I got my master's degree in New York.
I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. And but I would imagine the Bill Cosby show, which was, I don't know if you were familiar with that, but the Bill Cosby show to me would represent one of those more peaceful look at families, and so not just looking at individuals, but you were talking about Oprah. So the Bill Cosby show to me represented that, building peace and being respectful and, creating strong family values. And it seems like that would kind of line up a little bit versus like, Everybody Loves Raymond, where, in this comedy show, everyone's putting each other down and bullying each other, and then people are laughing about it, very different feel from, a family there versus the Cosby family.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And that the Cosby family or the Cosby show is actually a really good example. There's a book, it's more on the academic side, called Two Aspirants and a Comedy, by Meta Spencer. She's a Canadian researcher. And she actually, in her book, talks a lot about the Cosby show. She also talks about Northern Exposure, which I never watched, but she talks a lot about how that show was also did a lot of kind of conflict resolution and was framed in a certain way to help people work through issues. And so and she goes through a bunch of other movies too. I can't think of too many off the top of my head. But it's also interesting to look at it in music. And certainly like a band like U2, obviously has had a huge success. But they, a lot of their songs, being Irish, focused on the Irish Civil War and and the tragedy of it. And didn't glorify the violence, actually, talk a lot about how the violence was devastating. And they, talk a lot about creating peace and brotherhood and those kinds of concepts. And certainly Bono, I think, is now living it even more publicly with his activism on all kinds of different fronts.
So a lot of different people that are out there that the media doesn't always necessarily underscore, and they do. And I think a big key what you're saying is, as long as consumers keep requesting and demanding the types of violent movies, action movies, and things of that nature, it's going to feed that cycle. And so we have a part, not just the media, but we also have, as a consumer, have a part in breaking that cycle as well. And so that kind of leads, as we're going to start to go toward our closing here. And before I do, because one of the things I'm going to say is, what is the assignment? And we always give an assignment for the week or call to action. And so what is that call to action? But before we do that, is there anything more that you wanted to say about breaking the cycle?
Yeah, I think it's part of it is kind of staying away, and I'm not going to give away my assignment quite yet, but staying away from violent media, but also looking towards more peaceful media. And so actually one of my recommendations is a book called Sweet Fruit from the Bitter Tree. And that it's a very readable book. It's not very long, but I think it's 61 short stories of how people have overcome violent situations in peaceful ways. And they're all real life stories. And it's all, kind of the stories that you could potentially find on the evening news, like in the human interest section. But what's fascinating about it to me is that you read these stories of normal people and you can see yourself doing it too. Because, and this is how we're going to break this cycle. Is by having these ideas and having these options available to us, so that when we're in the critical moment, that even if it's a situation we haven't encountered before, we can say, oh, I remember the story where someone did that, and I'm going to try that out in this situation because it seems like it might work. So I think that would go a long way to breaking the cycle.
Well, I thank you so much for saying that. There's some, things that we don't even think of as consumers, with someone with your experience in the media and journalism, and then having a very unique combined degree of understanding peace and conflict, bringing that to the program here, because we've never done anything like this on our program. And so this, it sheds some light in a very different way. All right, so we actually have two kind of book recommendations, and one is the sweet fruit from the bitter tree. Is that right? It's the sweet fruit from the bitter tree.
Exactly.
Okay. And then the other, which is kind of interesting, is Two Aspirins and a Comedy. That talks about using television and movies and shows as it relates to that. So what is the assignment for the week or call to action? In addition to this book, do you have something more specific for them as well?
Yeah, so I think an amazing exercise to do is to sit down and literally make a list, whether it's on a Word document or on a piece of paper, but make a list of all the media that you consume. TV, radio, websites that you go on to, and remember the sneaky ones, like the elevator TV in high-rise buildings, or like the radio that's on in the dentist's office, or if you drive to work, maybe you hear other people's radios like from their cars, and billboards and advertisements and things like that. And so first make the list, and you might want to divide it into like media that you have control over, like your alarm, your radio going off when your alarm goes off, the podcast that you subscribe to, your newspaper subscription or your magazine subscriptions, and then media that you don't have control over. And then look at all the different programs and all the different media and think about what framing they have. And so are they talking about violence or conflicts? And are they talking about conflicts as something that can only be resolved with violence? or are they talking about conflicts in a way that can be resolved peacefully and that conflict resolution can occur? And thinking about the framing that all this media that we're constantly inundated with has, I think some of us or some of our listeners are going to find some really interesting things. And then you can take it to a next step and think about, how does it make you feel? And so if your alarm goes off every morning with at 6:45 in the morning, and that happens to be when there's the news bulletin, how does that make you feel? That the first thing you listen to when you're starting to come into consciousness is the news bulletin, and that the news bulletin is about everything that's wrong in the world, and how much traffic you're going to encounter on your way to work. And just looking at that, I think is an enlightening exercise. And probably some people are going to start making some changes once they realize everything that's coming into their mind and into their media space.
Okay, that's a great assignment. I love that, and because that really raises a whole nother level of awareness that we're not aware of, because we are bombarded. And I like the thing you said about kind of the sneaky places where it comes in that you don't even think about. But
right.
But it's still entering our conscious and subconscious minds for sure. All right, so you have a couple of websites. We mentioned one before, peacesexy.net. What are the other websites you want people to know about?
People can also check out the Peace Superheroes, and that website is peace-superheroes.com. And on there's also so on the Peace Superheroes website, there's a contact form if anyone wants to get involved with the initiative, or if anyone knows people that are involved in digital games who might be able to help out with us, or who anyone who does behavior change research. We're really interested in getting in touch with those people. So on Peace is Sexy, you can also get a free workbook called 16 Easy Shortcuts to a More Balanced, Happier, and Saner Life. And shortly, I'm going to have a couple more workbooks up on there too. One is going to be Navigating Dreaded Conversations with Ease, which you'll probably have some thoughts about, Patty. And then another one actually on media diet and awareness around media. So those will be coming out shortly. And if you subscribe to our newsletter or download the workbook, the 16 Easy Shortcuts workbook, then you'll find out as soon as they're available.
Oh, that's wonderful. So, I love that. And I love all three of those options, and to learn more and engage more. And I'm very curious about the media diet as well. So you have some workbook options, folks. You can find out more about the Peace Superheroes, or, Marianne is looking for assistance in a number of ways, as she's mentioned. Some really great interest in reading. Now, if someone has a recommendation for someone to be interviewed for the Peace is Sexy, how do they go about doing that?
There's also a contact form on Peace is Sexy. And actually, I think that's how I got you on Peace is Sexy, Patty, is because someone recommended that you be interviewed. And so there's a form that's knows someone that's peaceful and sexy, let us know. But there's also a contact us button, and you can send us an email directly. And if one of our listeners wants to be profiled on Peace is Sexy, we'd love to have you. Or if you know someone that's doing really amazing peace work and who has a great story, we'd love to profile them too. And it could be people, it could be organizations, it could be cultural stuff, music, movies, games, TV, apps. And we also have a Peace Profitable section where we profile businesses.
Okay, that's I'm really, because it really fits with your broader definition of peace. So it's great that you're interviewing all along the spectrum there, as you mentioned, from businesses, individuals, culture, things of that nature. So that's great. I'm so excited that you've been able to really educate our listening audience about the things that you're out there doing and promoting, and with such passion. What final message do you want to leave with listeners tonight?
Well, I would really encourage all our listeners to be peace superheroes in their daily lives by modeling peaceful and nonviolent behaviors and cultivating your peace superpowers, whatever they may be.
Love it. Great. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.